I should have opened that door, Richard Coleman whispers as he stands alone in the cold night air, his breath turning into thin clouds under the pale glow of winter lights. The cemetery stretching quiet and still around him as snow settles gently over polished stone, his expensive coat doing little to shield the weight pressing down on his chest. Because this is not about the cold, it is about the memory that refuses to fade. The one moment he keeps replaying no matter how far he tries to move on, his eyes fixed on the name carved into the granite in front of him. A name that once meant nothing and now means everything. A name tied to a promise he never kept. And for a man who built his entire life on control, on decisions, on never looking back, this single regret has become the one thing he cannot escape. His voice barely steady as he repeats it again, softer this time. I should have opened that door. And as the wind shifts and the silence deepens, the world seems to pull backward, like time itself refusing to stay still, dragging him away from this moment and back to that night. The night everything could have changed. The night snow fell just like this, heavy and quiet, covering the city in a false sense of peace. The night his mansion stood bright against the darkness, warm lights spilling from tall windows, a symbol of success, of distance, of a life carefully built to keep everything uncomfortable on the outside. And inside that house, Richard Coleman was exactly who everyone believed him to be. A billionaire who had no time for interruptions, no patience for inconvenience, and certainly no reason to open his door to anyone he did not expect, until there was a knock, soft at first, almost easy to ignore, but then again, a little louder this time, steady, deliberate, impossible to mistake. And even now, standing years later with nothing but regret and silence, he can still feel that moment pressing in on him, that split second where everything could have gone differently, where one choice stood between the life he continued living and the one he lost forever. And as the memory sharpens, as the sound of that knock echoes clearer in his mind, his eyes close. Slowly, because he knows exactly what comes next, he knows the hesitation, the annoyance, the decision he made without thinking, and he knows that behind that door, in the cold, waiting with quiet patience, was someone who would change everything. Someone he almost never let in. The knock came again, clearer this time, cutting through the quiet comfort of the house as Richard Coleman stood still for a moment, his hand hovering near the glass of bourbon he had not yet tasted, his jaw tightening slightly as irritation flickered across his face because nothing good ever arrived unannounced, especially on a night meant for quiet and control. And yet something about the rhythm of that knock refused to feel random. It was not rushed, not desperate, just steady, patient, almost as if whoever stood outside already knew he would come to the door eventually. And that thought alone unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He exhaled slowly, setting the glass down with a soft click before, straightening his posture, reminding himself of who he was. A man who did not get pulled into unnecessary moments. A man who decided when and how things happened, and yet his feet moved anyway. Each step toward the front door measured but reluctant, the warmth of the house fading slightly as he approached the tall wooden frame that separated his world from whatever waited outside. He paused just long enough to glance at the security monitor, expecting to see nothing more than a delivery mistake or someone lost, but instead he saw her, a small figure standing alone beneath the falling snow, her coat too thin for the weather, her posture calm despite the cold, her face partially shadowed but unmistakably focused, not scared, not nervous, just waiting. And that was the part that did not make sense, because people who came to his door uninvited usually carried urgency, or fear, or need. But this girl carried something else, something quieter, something that felt intentional, and for a brief second he considered ignoring it, turning away, letting the moment pass like everything else he chose not to deal with. But the knock echoed again, softer now, as if reminding him that silence would not erase what was already there. And before he could talk himself out of it, his hand reached for the handle, the door opening just enough to let the cold air slip inside. Brushing against his face as his eyes met hers for the first time, she looked up at him without hesitation, her expression steady, her breath visible in the freezing air. And he spoke first, his tone controlled but distant as he said, "You should not be here, not tonight." Expecting her to apologize or step back or say she had the wrong house. But she did none of that. Instead, she held his gaze and said in a quiet, even voice, "You knew my mother." And just like that, the world he had carefully built paused. Not completely, not enough to break, but enough for a crack to form beneath the surface. His brows tightened, confusion mixing with something deeper as he responded without thinking, "I think you have the wrong person." But even as the words left his mouth, something in her eyes made it harder to believe them. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, letting the silence stretch between them before adding, "You promised her you would come back." And this time the cold did not come from the air outside. It settled somewhere deeper, somewhere he had not allowed himself to revisit in a long time. And for the first time that night, Richard Coleman felt something shift, small but undeniable. As if the past he had left behind was no longer willing to stay there. Richard Coleman did not answer right away. And for a man who always had something to say, that silence felt heavier than any response he could have given, his hand still gripping the edge of the door as the cold air slipped further into the warm space behind him. But he did not step aside. Not yet. His eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the girl more closely, searching for something that would make sense of what she had just said, something that would allow him to dismiss it, to place it into a category he understood. But nothing about her felt accidental. Her posture remained steady, her gaze unwavering, and that calmness unsettled him more than if she had been crying or begging. Because this was not desperation, this was certainty, and certainty meant there was something he did not know, or something he did not want to remember. He finally spoke, his voice lower now, more controlled but less confident than before, as he said, "You should not be repeating things you do not understand." But even as he said it, the words felt hollow, like a defense he had used too many times before, and she did not react the way he expected. She did not argue. She did not look offended. She simply tilted her head slightly and asked, "Then why did you say you would come back?" And that question landed differently, not as an accusation, but as something closer to confusion, as if she truly expected an answer. And for a brief moment, he almost gave one, almost let something slip, but instead he shook his head, stepping back half an inch as if distance alone could restore control, and said, "You have the wrong person. I do not make promises like that." But the moment the sentence ended, something flickered in his memory, not clear, not fully formed, just a fragment, a voice, a night, a feeling he had buried beneath years of decisions and distractions, and it was enough to make him hesitate again. She noticed it. Of course she did, her eyes softening just slightly, not in victory, not in relief, but in recognition, as if she had been waiting for that exact reaction. And then she reached into the pocket of her coat, slowly, deliberately, not in a way that caused alarm, but in a way that demanded attention, and he felt his chest tighten without understanding why. His gaze locked onto her hand as she pulled out something small, something worn, something that had clearly been held onto for a long time. But she did not show it to him immediately. She kept it in her palm, closed just enough to keep it hidden as she looked back up at him, and said, "I did not come here to argue. I came because she told me to find you." And that sentence shifted the air between them again, because this was no longer about a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was about intention, about something set in motion long before this night. And he could feel it now, the edges of a past he had avoided starting to press in, not fully breaking through, but enough to make it harder to stand where he was, enough to make the door feel less like a barrier and more like a choice he was running out of time to make. And for the first time since opening it, Richard Coleman did not look past her. He looked at her, really looked. And something about that moment told him that whatever she was about to reveal was not something he could ignore again. The silence stretched just long enough to feel uncomfortable, but neither of them stepped back from it. Richard Coleman's grip on the door tightening slightly as his eyes remained fixed on the small object in her hand, still hidden but no longer ignorable. And for reasons he could not explain, he felt a quiet pressure building in his chest, like something was approaching that he was not ready to face. He cleared his throat softly, trying to regain the authority that had always defined him, and said, "You said she told you to find me. When exactly did she say that?" His tone calm, but edged with something sharper now, something closer to urgency. And the girl did not hesitate. She answered simply, "Before she passed away." And the words landed heavier than he expected, not dramatic, not loud, just steady and final. He looked away for a brief second, as if recalculating something. Then back at her as he said, "That still does not explain why you are here. People say things before they go. It does not make them true." But even as he spoke, his voice lacked the certainty it carried only moments before, and she seemed to hear that, because she did not argue again. Instead, she slowly opened her hand, revealing what she had been holding, and this time she lifted it just enough for him to see, not forcing it forward, just offering it, a worn photograph, its edges softened by time, its surface slightly faded but still clear enough to make out the figures within it. And the moment his eyes landed on it, everything inside him shifted, not all at once, not like a sudden shock, but like something long buried beginning to rise, slow and undeniable. His breath caught slightly, barely noticeable, but enough for her to see. And for the first time since this conversation began, he did not speak right away, because he recognized it. Not the details, not immediately, but the feeling, the sense that this was something real, something connected to a version of himself he had chosen to leave behind. She took a small step closer, careful not to cross the threshold, and said, "She told me if I ever found you, I should give you this." And the way she said it made it clear this was not a guess, not a hope, but a message delivered exactly as it had been given to her. And that precision made it harder to dismiss, harder to reduce to coincidence. His eyes remained on the photograph, but his mind had already started moving elsewhere, searching through memories he had not revisited in years, fragments beginning to align in ways he could not control, and it made him uncomfortable, more than he was willing to admit, because control had always been his advantage, his shield, and right now it was slipping. Piece by piece, he finally spoke again, his voice quieter, more deliberate as he asked, "Where did you get this?" And she answered without hesitation, "From my mother." The simplicity of it removing any space for doubt, and in that moment, the distance between past and present narrowed just enough for him to feel it, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that whatever stood on the other side of that door was not something he could walk away from as easily as he once would have. And for the first time, the question was no longer why she was here, but why. He had not seen this coming. Richard Coleman stared at the photograph longer than he intended to, his mind no longer fully present in the cold night or the warm glow behind him, but somewhere in between, caught in the quiet space where recognition begins to take shape, his fingers slowly lifting as if drawn by something beyond logic, and without fully deciding to do so, he reached forward and took the photograph from her hand. The paper felt lighter than it should have, fragile, as though it carried more weight in memory than in reality, his eyes scanning it carefully now, taking in the details that had once meant nothing but now felt dangerously familiar. A younger version of himself stood in the frame, less polished, less guarded, standing beside a woman whose face he had not allowed himself to remember in years, her expression warm, her presence unmistakable, and between them, captured in that single frozen moment, was a sense of something he had never fully understood at the time, something real, something human, something he had chosen to leave behind. His jaw tightened slightly as the realization deepened, not sudden, not overwhelming, but steady and undeniable, and the longer he looked, the harder it became to separate who he was now from who he had been then. He exhaled slowly, the breath uneven despite his effort to control it, and without looking up, he asked her what was her name, his voice quieter than before, almost careful, and she answered without hesitation her name was Lillian Johnson, and the name landed exactly where it needed to, breaking through the last barrier he had built around that part of his past. His eyes closed briefly, just for a second, but enough for the memory to shift from distant fragments into something clearer, something that could no longer be ignored. He remembered the small apartment, the late nights, the conversations that felt simple at the time but carried more meaning than he had realized. He remembered the promise, the one he had dismissed as temporary, something he would return to when it was convenient, when success no longer demanded every part of him. But convenience had never come, and success had taken everything instead, including the part of him that once believed promises mattered. He opened his eyes again, the photograph still in his hand, but now it felt heavier, not physically, but in what it represented. He finally looked back at the girl, really looked this time, noticing the details he had overlooked before, the shape of her eyes, the quiet strength in the way she stood, the familiarity that had been there from the beginning but had not made sense until now. and he asked how long ago. Did she pass? His voice steady but carrying something deeper beneath it. And she answered last winter, just before the snow started, the timing settling into the moment with a quiet finality, and he nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. As if accepting something he could not change, the silence returned again, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with everything that had been left unsaid for years, and as he stood there holding the photograph, with the girl still waiting just outside his door, Richard Coleman understood something he had avoided for a long time, that this was not just a memory returning, this was a consequence, one that had arrived quietly, patiently, and right on time. The name lingered in the air longer than anything else that had been said that night, and Richard Coleman felt it settle into him with a weight he could not push away, his fingers tightening slightly around the photograph, as if holding onto it might somehow give him more control over what he was feeling. But control was already slipping, not in a dramatic way, not in a way anyone else might notice, but enough for him to recognize that this moment was no longer something he could manage like everything else in his life. He shifted his stance subtly, the cold now reaching him more clearly as the door remained only partially open. Yet he made no move to close it, because closing it would mean ending something that had already begun, and he was no longer certain he had the right to do that. His gaze moved from the photograph back to the girl, Amara, and for a brief moment, he searched her face again, not for doubt this time, but for confirmation, and it was there, not in words, but in the quiet way she held herself, in the patience that did not demand anything yet carried everything. He exhaled slowly, then asked, "How did you find me?" His voice steady but quieter than before, and she answered, "She kept your name. She said if I ever needed to understand anything, I should find you." The phrasing struck him differently, not as a request, but as a direction, something intentional, something planned, and it made him look back at the photograph again, this time noticing details he had missed before. The way Lillian had been looking at him in that moment, not just present, but certain, as if she had already known something he had not, and that thought unsettled him more than anything else, because it suggested that whatever this was, it had not started tonight. It had been set in motion long ago, and he had simply been unaware or unwilling to see it. He swallowed quietly, then asked the question he had been avoiding since the moment she spoke her name. "What do you want from me?" And the way he asked it revealed more than he intended, not defensive, not dismissive, but uncertain. And she seemed to understand that, because her answer came without hesitation and without demand. "I do not want anything. I just wanted you to know." The simplicity of it left him without an immediate response, because he was used to expectations, to negotiations, to outcomes that could be measured and resolved. But this offered nothing to solve, nothing to fix, only something to face. And that made it harder, not easier. He looked past her briefly, the empty street stretching out under the falling snow, quiet and undisturbed, as if the rest of the world had stepped aside for this moment. Then back at her again, realizing that she had not moved, had not asked to come inside, had not even suggested it. She had come to deliver something, and now she stood waiting, not for permission, but for acknowledgement, and that distinction settled into him slowly, shifting the weight of the moment in a way he could not ignore. His grip on the photograph loosened slightly, not because it mattered less, but because he was beginning to understand that holding on to it would not change what it meant. And for the first time since this began, Richard Coleman felt something unfamiliar rise within him, not guilt in the way he had experienced it before, not regret as a distant thought, but something quieter, something closer to responsibility. And it did not come with instructions. It did not offer an easy path forward. It simply remained there, asking to be recognized. And as he stood in the doorway between the life he had built and the past that had found him, he realized that the choice in front of him was no longer about whether to believe her, but about what kind of man he was willing to be now that he understood. Richard Coleman stood there longer than he realized, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but heavy with something that could not be undone. The photograph still in his hand, the girl still in front of him, and the space between them no longer defined by distance but by everything that had not been said. He looked at her again, more carefully now, not searching for proof, but recognizing what had been there from the beginning. The resemblance not in obvious features, but in something deeper, in the way she held her ground without asking, in the quiet certainty that did not need to be explained. And it made something inside him tighten, because it reminded him of Lillian in a way he had not allowed himself to remember. He shifted slightly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show that the resistance he had started with was no longer as strong. And he said, "She never told me about you." The words coming out slower than he intended, not as a defense, but as a realization, and Amara nodded once. Not surprised, as if she had expected that answer all along, she said. "She said you had your own life, that you were building something important, and that you would come back when it was time." The sentence settled into him with a quiet weight, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual, and that made it harder to push away, because there was no argument to be made against something that had simply been true at the time. He remembered those conversations now, not perfectly, not every word, but the feeling of them, the way he had convinced himself that leaving was temporary, that everything he was doing had a purpose, that success would allow him to return stronger, better, ready to fulfill every promise he had made. But time had not waited for him, and neither had life. And now he was standing here, years later, realizing that the moment he thought he could come back to had already passed without him. He looked down at the photograph again, then back at Amara, and asked quietly how long did she wait. And Amara did not answer right away. She looked down, briefly, then back up at him and said long enough to stop waiting. The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else she had said, because it filled in the space he had left behind, not with anger, not with blame, but with the reality of what happens when time moves forward without someone. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, not trying to argue, not trying to justify, just letting it exist. And for the first time that night, he felt the full distance between who he had been and who he had become, not measured in years or success, but in choices, in moments he had decided were not important enough at the time. He glanced past her again, the quiet street unchanged, the snow still, falling as if nothing had happened, and yet everything had shifted. And when he looked back at her, there was something different in his expression now, not clarity, not resolution, but a willingness to stay in the moment instead of stepping away from it. He asked one more question, softer this time, "What made you come tonight?" And Amara answered, "Because she said if I waited any longer, it would be too late." And the words landed with a quiet finality that he could not ignore, because somewhere, deep down, he understood exactly what she meant, not just about her, but about himself, about the way he had always believed there would be more time, more chances, more opportunities to make things right. And now, standing in the doorway with the past and present meeting in front of him, he realized that time had already made its decision. And what he did next was the only thing left that still belonged to him. Richard Coleman felt the weight of her last words settle into the quiet space between them, and for a moment he said nothing, not because he did not have something to say, but because every response he could think of felt smaller than the truth he was beginning to understand. His grip on the photograph loosened slightly as he looked down at it again, tracing the edges with his thumb as if trying to reconnect with a version of himself that no longer felt familiar. And it struck him then that the man in that photograph had believed in things he had slowly traded away. Promises, time, presence, things that could not be measured or controlled the way he had learned to measure everything else. He exhaled slowly and stepped back just enough for the door to open wider, not fully, not yet, but enough to change the space between inside and outside. And the warmth from the house reached her more clearly now, brushing against the cold that had settled into her coat. She noticed it, but she did not move forward. She stayed exactly where she was, as if the decision was not hers to make, and that detail did not go unnoticed by him, because it made him realize that she was not asking to come in. She was giving him the choice to invite her, and that difference mattered more than he expected. He looked at her again and asked, "Did she ever say anything else about me?" His voice steady but carrying a quiet hesitation, and Amara nodded once, then said, "She said you were not a bad man, just a man who kept choosing the wrong things at the right time." The sentence landed with a precision that caught him off guard, not harsh, not accusing, but uncomfortably accurate. And for the first time since she arrived, a faint expression crossed his face, not quite a smile, not quite regret, but something closer to recognition, as if hearing the truth spoken so simply removed any space he had left to deny it. He let out a quiet breath and said she always had a way of seeing things clearly. And as the words left him, They carried something softer than anything he had said before, something closer to respect, to memory, to something unfinished. The silence returned again, but it felt different now, less tense, more grounded, as if both of them understood that whatever needed to be said had already been spoken, and what remained was not conversation, but decision. He glanced briefly into the house behind him. The lights, the quiet, the life he had built, everything still exactly as it had been before the knock, untouched, unchanged, and yet it no longer felt separate from what was happening now. It felt connected, as if the line between the two had always been there, just ignored. He turned back to her and said, "You came all this way just to tell me this?" And she nodded. Again, then added, "She said you would understand when the time was right." And that sentence settled into him with a quiet certainty, because deep down, he knew the time she had been talking about was not measured by success or age or achievement. It was measured by readiness, by the moment when he could no longer pretend that what he had left behind did not matter. And standing there now, with the cold air and the open door and the past no longer distant, he understood exactly what she meant. He looked at her once more, taking in the full reality of who she was, not just as a messenger, not just as a reminder, but as something far more significant. And in that moment, the question he had been avoiding shifted into something else entirely. Not what had happened, not why she was here, but what he was willing to do now that he finally understood it all. Richard Coleman let her words settle fully before he moved again, not physically at first, but internally, as if something long delayed had finally reached a point where it could no longer remain unresolved. He looked at the photograph one more time and then carefully turned it over, expecting nothing. And yet there it was, a small line written in faded ink, almost too faint to read but still clear enough to understand. It said, "You will know when it is time." And for a moment, everything around him seemed to fall silent in a way that was different from before, deeper, more final, because this was not just memory anymore. This was intention carried forward across years, and he realized that Lillian had not just hoped he would remember. She had prepared for the possibility that he would not. And that thought carried a quiet kind of grace that made it even harder to face. He lowered the photograph slightly and looked back at Amara, his expression no longer guarded, no longer trying to control the direction of the conversation, but open in a way he was not used to. He asked softly, "How did she raise you?" The question not about circumstance, but about understanding. And Amara answered, "She worked every day. She did not talk about the past much, but she kept this safe, and she told me it mattered." The way she said it carried no complaint, no bitterness, just truth. And that truth settled into him in a way that shifted something deeper than regret, because it was not about what he had done wrong in a single moment. It was about everything that had followed, everything he had chosen not to return to, not to check on, not to finish. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, and then asked another question that felt heavier than the rest. Did she ever need anything? And Amara paused this time. Not long, but enough to show that the answer mattered. Then she said she needed time, and she waited for it. And that was all. The simplicity of the answer removed any excuse he might have held on to, because time had been the one thing he always believed he had enough of, the one thing he had treated as flexible, as something that could be delayed and revisited. And now he understood that it had been the one thing that mattered most. He exhaled slowly, a quiet breath that carried more weight than any words he could have spoken, and for a moment he looked away again, not to avoid her, but to take in the reality of everything that had led to this exact point. The snow still falling, the night still calm, the world unchanged except for him. And when he looked back at her, something had shifted in his expression, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to show that he was no longer standing at a distance from this moment. He was inside it now. Fully aware of what it meant, he stepped back another inch, the door opening just a little wider, the warmth reaching her more clearly, but still he did not speak, because he understood now that this was not about saying the right thing. It was about doing something he had not done before, something simple, something direct, something that did not require explanation or justification. And as he stood there, holding the photograph that connected the past to the present, with the girl who carried that connection standing patiently in front of him, Richard Coleman realized that the choice in front of him was no longer about what had already happened. It was about whether he would finally act in a way that matched what he now understood, and for the first time in a very long time, He did not hesitate because he did not know what to do. He hesitated because he knew exactly what it would mean. Richard Coleman finally moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a quiet intention that carried more weight than anything he had done so far. His hand shifting from the edge of the door to the handle as he pulled it open wider. The barrier between them no longer just slightly parted but clearly removed, the warm light from inside spilling out into the cold night, reaching Amara fully now. And for the first time since she arrived, the space between outside and inside felt less like a divide and more like an invitation. He stepped back half a step, creating room without saying a word, his eyes still on her, waiting, not commanding, not assuming, just allowing the moment to exist as it was. And Amara noticed. Of course she did. But she did not rush forward. She looked at him for a brief second longer, as if confirming something that had nothing to do with the house or the warmth, but everything to do with him. And only then did she take a small step closer, crossing the threshold carefully, not as someone entering a place that belonged to someone else, but as someone stepping into a moment that had been waiting for her. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but it changed everything. Because once she was inside, the conversation could no longer remain at a distance. It became real in a different way, grounded, present, unavoidable. Richard closed the door slowly behind her, the sound soft but final, sealing the moment in a way that made it clear there was no returning to how things had been before. He stood there for a second, the photograph still in his hand, the silence settling again but no longer empty. And then he spoke, not loudly. Not with the certainty he once carried, but with something more honest than that. He said, "I should have come back." The words simple, direct, and for the first time that night, completely unguarded. Amara did not respond right away. She looked around briefly, taking in the space, the warmth, the quiet, and then back at him, her expression unchanged. Not surprised, not relieved, just present, and that presence made it easier for him to continue, because she was not asking for anything. She was not demanding explanation or apology. She was simply there, and that forced him to face the truth without distraction. He walked a few steps into the room, placing the photograph carefully on a nearby table as if it deserved more respect now than it ever had before. Then he turned back to her and asked, "Where are you staying?" The question practical, but carrying something deeper beneath it. And she answered with the same calm tone she had used all along, "I am not." The words were not dramatic, not framed as a problem, just a fact. And that fact settled into the room with quiet clarity. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. And for a moment he did not speak, not because he did not understand, but because he was adjusting to what understanding required of him. His gaze shifted briefly, then returned to her, and something in his posture changed again, not completely, but enough to show that the man who had opened the door earlier was not the same one standing here now. He said, "You can stay here tonight." The sentence straightforward, without hesitation, without conditions, and though it was a small action in comparison to everything that had already passed between them, it carried a significance that neither of them needed to explain, because it was not about solving the past. It was about choosing differently in the present. And as Amara stood there, no longer outside in the cold, but inside a space that had once been closed to her, Richard Coleman understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he had avoided for far too long, something that would not be resolved in a single night, but had finally, unmistakably, begun. The house felt different with her inside, not because anything had physically changed, but because the space no longer belonged only to him. And that subtle shift settled into Richard Coleman in a way he could not ignore. He walked slowly toward the living area, not to create distance, but to give the moment room to breathe, then gestured lightly toward a chair near the fireplace, saying, "You can sit there. It is warmer," his tone calm, not instructing, just offering. And Amara moved without hesitation, her steps quiet, her posture still composed as she took the seat, the fire casting a soft light across her face, revealing details he had not noticed clearly before, the slight tiredness in her eyes, the calm strength in the way she held herself, and it made him realize how much he had missed simply by not being present. He remained standing for a moment, unsure of where to place himself in a situation that did not follow any of the patterns he was used to. Then he sat across from her, leaving enough space between them to respect what had not yet been said, but close enough to acknowledge that distance was no longer the goal. Silence returned. But it felt steadier now, less uncertain, more like a pause than a barrier. And after a moment he spoke again, his voice measured but softer than before as he said, "I do not know how to fix what I did not do." The sentence honest in a way that did not seek forgiveness, only clarity. And Amara listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, not judging, not comforting, just present. And that presence allowed him to continue. Because it removed the need to defend himself, he added, "I thought I had time. I thought I could come back when things were in place, when I had built something that mattered, but I never stopped to think about what I was leaving behind." The words came slowly, not rehearsed, not shaped for effect, just real. And as he spoke them, he seemed to understand them more fully himself. Amara tilted her head slightly, then said she knew that. She said, "You always believed you were doing the right thing, even when it meant leaving," and the sentence landed. Without accusation, simply completing what he had started. He nodded once, acknowledging it, then asked did she ever say she was angry. And Amara shook her head gently and said no. She said you would carry it longer than she ever would. And that answer shifted something again, because it removed the last piece of resistance he might have held on to. There was no anger to respond to, no blame to argue against, only the quiet weight of a promise not kept, and what it had become over time. He looked down briefly, then back at her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer trying to hold anything back, and he said, "I do not want to miss anything else, not this time." The sentence simple, but carrying a clear intention, not to erase the past, but to change what came next. Amara watched him for a moment, then asked, "What does that mean?" Not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, and he paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that whatever he said now would matter, not just in words, but in what he chose to do after. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady as he said, "It means I stay, I listen, and I do not leave when it becomes inconvenient." The words were not dramatic, but they were different, because they were not about what he had achieved, but about what he was willing to change. And as he said them, the distance between the man he had been and the man he was becoming narrowed just enough to feel real, not complete, not perfect, but real enough to begin. Richard Coleman let his own words settle in the space between them, not as a declaration, but as something that needed to be tested over time. And for the first time that night, he did not feel the need to fill the silence that followed, because he understood now that silence was not something to escape from. It was something to sit with, to allow, to respect. Amara remained where she was, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her expression unchanged. But there was something different in the way she looked at him now. Not trust, not yet, but something closer to openness, as if she was willing to see what he would do next rather than judge what he had already done. And that subtle shift mattered more than anything he could have asked for. He leaned back slightly, taking a slow breath as he looked around the room, noticing things he had stopped seeing a long time ago. The decorations placed carefully for the season, the quiet luxury that once felt like proof of something important and now felt incomplete without the presence of something real. He glanced toward the table where the photograph rested, its edges catching the soft light, and for a moment he considered what it meant that such a small object had carried so much across time, had bridged a distance he had not even realized existed until it stood in front of him. He turned back to Amara and asked, "Would you like something warm to drink?" The question simple, but intentional, and she nodded once, saying thank you. And that small exchange shifted the atmosphere again, not dramatically, but enough to ground the moment in something present, something tangible. He stood and walked toward the kitchen, his steps slower than usual, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. Because every action now felt like part of something larger than routine. He prepared 2 cups of hot chocolate, something he had not done in years, not because he could not, but because he had never needed to. And as he carried them back, he realized that need was not always about necessity. Sometimes it was about connection. He handed one to her carefully, making sure his movement was steady, respectful, and she accepted it with a quiet thank you, her hands wrapping around the warmth as if it was something she had been missing. He sat down again, holding his own cup but not drinking, his attention still focused on her. And after a moment he said, "I do not know everything about your life, but I would like to, not all at once, not in a way that feels forced, but in a way that allows you to decide what you want to share." The words measured, not trying to take control of the conversation, but offering space for it to grow. And Amara listened, then asked why, not challenging, but genuinely curious, and he did not answer immediately. Because he understood that the answer mattered, he looked down, briefly, then back at her, and said, because I missed the chance to know someone who mattered, and I do not want to miss the chance again. The sentence carried no embellishment, no attempt to make it sound better than it was, just the truth as he understood it now. And she considered it quietly, not reacting right away, and that pause was important, because it showed that she was not accepting his words simply because he said them. She was weighing them, deciding what they meant to her, and after a moment she said, my mother used to say people show who they are by what they do after they understand, not before, and the statement settled into him with a clarity that felt both grounding and challenging. Because it removed any illusion that words alone would be enough. It set a standard that could not be spoken into existence, only lived, and he nodded slowly, acknowledging it without hesitation, because for the first time, he was not looking for an easier path. He was ready to accept what the harder one required, and as the fire continued to burn quietly beside them, casting a steady light across the room, the moment shifted from something unexpected into something intentional, not resolved, not complete, but moving forward in a way that neither of them needed to rush, because what mattered now was not how quickly things changed, but that they finally had the chance to change it all. The fire continued to burn steadily, its quiet warmth filling the room in a way that felt different now, not just as comfort, but as presence, and Richard Coleman sat there with the cup in his hands, no longer thinking about what he should say next, but about what this moment actually required of him. Amara remained across from him, calm as she had been from the beginning, yet there was a subtle shift in the space between them, something less guarded, less distant, not fully trust, but no longer uncertainty either, and that change did not come from anything dramatic. It came from the simple fact that neither of them had turned away. Time passed in small, quiet ways, the kind that usually went unnoticed, but here it felt important, as if every second added something that had been missing. Before, Richard glanced toward the photograph again, then reached for it, holding it carefully, and for the first time, he did not see it as a reminder of what he had lost, but as a connection that still existed, something that had not been erased by time, only delayed. He looked back at Amara and said, she trusted me more than I deserved, and Amara responded softly, she trusted that you would understand eventually. The distinction mattered, and he nodded slowly, accepting it without trying to reshape it into something easier. He stood then, not abruptly, but with a quiet purpose, and walked toward the window, looking out at the snow still falling, the night unchanged, the world continuing exactly as it always had, and yet everything felt different, because he was no longer standing outside of his own choices. He had stepped into them, fully aware, fully present. He spoke again, not turning back right away as he said, I spent years building a life that kept everything in order, everything controlled, but I never realized that control was also keeping things out, and some of those things mattered more than anything I built. His voice was steady, not emotional in the way he once feared, but grounded in something deeper, something clearer, and when he turned back toward her, there was no hesitation in his expression, only intention. He walked back to where she sat, and stopped just short of the space between them, not to create distance, but to respect it, and he said, I cannot change what I did not do, but I can decide what I do now, and that is not a promise for later, that is a decision for this moment. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that came from understanding, not from performance. Amara looked at him for a long second, not searching for perfection, not expecting certainty, but recognizing something real, and that recognition was enough. She did not respond with approval or doubt. She simply nodded once, and that small gesture held more meaning than any reassurance could have, because it acknowledged the moment without trying to define it. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was steady, as if both of them understood that this was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one that would unfold slowly, over time, through choices rather than words. And as the night continued around them, the house no longer felt like a place of separation, but a place where something long delayed had finally found its way forward, not perfect, not complete, but real. And for Richard Coleman, that was something he had not allowed himself to experience in a very long time, and he knew, without needing to say it again, that this time, He would not walk away.